How many times have you been sitting in church and you've heard this particular sermon? The preacher goes, "What kind of idols do you have in your life? What have you been putting as a higher priority in your life than God? Have you been prioritizing your job, your wife, your vacation, your sports ball team? Anything you prioritize over God in your life, that's an idol." Let me read today this passage from Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 through 5. "Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me." I think we've all been there. We've all heard that particular sermon, and it's wrong. Let's get into it today. We have to make a distinction between what idols are and a lack of piety. Piety and idolatry are not the same thing at all. They're very different, and they're looked at very differently from almost every religious aspect. Every culture in the world has looked at these two different things from a completely different perspective. And I would say that today it's completely normal for contemporary Christians to have no interaction whatsoever with idols. It just doesn't happen in the modern world. Unless you live outside of the West, where idolatry is actually possible to see on a day-to-day basis, you're never going to encounter an idol. And so what I've noticed has happened is that contemporary Christians have tried to make this passage relevant to themselves. And so they want to keep these teachings. I mean, this is the 10 Commandments, right? Like, this is supposed to be super relevant to every aspect of our lives. And they've confused this idea of prioritization with idolatry. And simply prioritizing something over God is not setting up an idol in your life. And I can prove this. So, idol worship is a very specific thing. And unless you're actually worshiping something, you can't be considered it as engaging in idolatry. And idolatry is a very serious offense. It's more serious than impiety. And worship is a specific act which is performed in a specific manner in order to commune with that which is in the spiritual plane, in order to accomplish something with that communication. Typically, you're going to be, praising and worshiping a deity. You're going to be asking for favors. You're going to be praying on someone else's behalf. You're going to be asking for mercy. You're attempting to get something out of this relationship, and you're attempting to demonstrate that you hold the deity that you're praying to in highest esteem. You're attempting to worship that particular entity, that particular deity. And the only way that you can worship something is by actually worshiping it. And worshiping is a very, very, very specific thing. This isn't something that you can do just without thinking. This is something that you have to do. You have to be intentional. And think about, for example, praying to a god in the Bantu religion, as you sprinkle blood on its shrine, that's worship. Crossing oneself and praying to the triune Godhead in praise and adoration of that Godhead's virtue, that's worship. You're engaging in a very specific act. You're saying specific things. You're doing a specific action. But buying a car and thinking about it a lot isn't worship. You're not performing a specific act of actual worship, which is different from veneration, by the way. A specific act of worship to the car deity. This isn't the same thing at all. Talking to your coworkers about Jesus isn't worship. It's a spiritual thing that you're doing. You're engaging in a spiritual task. You're attempting to accomplish something for the kingdom of heaven, but you're not worshiping God when you're doing that. Simply breathing isn't worshiping God. But dancing in a powwow and chanting to the Great Spirit for rain or blessings or whatever it is that you're praying for, that's an act of worship. And unless performed in a specific manner for a specific purpose, an act can never be classified as worship. And this definition here is how we're going to understand the difference between idol worship and prioritization. Because we can see through traditional forms of Christianity that they took the act of worship very seriously. They understood that you had to do specific things, and that's why you have a liturgical worship service in the most ancient forms of Christianity. And that's also why ever-changing worship services actually inhibit the ability of an individual to engage in worship rather than helping them in their attempt to engage in worship. For example, we can understand this if we start thinking about the examples of how worship actually happens and how we interact with each other and all that sort of thing, by thinking about, okay, well, perhaps if we are in our attempts to worship, we realize, we're not really there mentally, we're very distracted. So we need to do something in order to boost our concentration, get our blood flowing. And so, maybe a preacher gets together and he says, we're going to start worshiping God by hanging upside down. And we're going to do this to increase blood flow to our brains. And because we have to be way more concentrated on what we're actually doing, we're going to have a more intense worship experience. You can all understand instantly, like, you're going to hang upside down? Are you crazy? That's ridiculous. But I use that example because extreme examples help us to understand that innovation, or help us to understand points, period. But it's also going to help us to understand just how innovations actually disrupt our ability to worship. Even, for example, if you're right that hanging upside down is going to improve mental acuity, it's going to be very distracting, and all of the people that need to transition into this new form of worship are going to be left out, and there's going to be this whole very distracting and unhelpful thing that goes on there. And additionally, we know that some activities are certainly not worshipful, and therefore it becomes necessary to define what the limits of a worship service can withstand, how far you can go, and we need to understand what activity specifically can be classifiable as a worship activity and not as another activity. So, for example, a lot of times when we think about worship, we think, well, we need to get some people together, we need to pray, we need to sing, we need to do whatever. But for example, if we think about attending a sports ball game and singing along with 10,000 people as a popular song comes over the speaker system, well, even if you're with other like-minded folks, even if you're very into the music, even if whatever's happening, we can all understand, okay, this isn't a worship activity. Even though we're engaging in all of the outward practices of worship, this isn't actually worship because it's missing specific elements. So even though, frankly, it contains all of the necessary elements that we would expect and demand out of worship services in most Christian traditions, it doesn't make the cut. And the reason it's not going to make the cut here is because we're doing it outside of the necessary limits to what a worship service is supposed to be, where you're supposed to be at, who you're supposed to be doing it with, and what you're supposed to be singing about. All of these things are sort of going to be broken down in the attempt to engage in worship at a sports ball game. And for another example, and that proves that community is not enough. And another example here, though, speaking of community, is actually the Hermit Example. If you have a particular individual who's been really struggling with their faith, they really want to get closer to God, they want to, boost their worship abilities and they want to do this by purifying themselves. And that purification can only happen by them going out into the wilderness and being separated from people and really just trying to just dig into themselves in order to root out evil, in order to get closer to God and doing all of that kind of stuff. It may be really, really beneficial in the beginning, but at some point we all understand that somebody who's alone for too long goes crazy because humans are naturally communal creatures. So you can't do this by yourself. And you have to do it with a community, but you can't just do it with any community, and you can't do it any way that you want to do it. So, we all see that worship has to follow the rules that are built into the religion that worship service, that worship act is going to take place within, because every religion has a specific philosophy and a specific theology that is taught because of their philosophy. Every religion is going to engage in that activity in a little bit of a different way, but they all have similarities. And you can tell the differences between the religious aspects, the religious folks and the non-religious folks, and how they engage in their daily lives based on the philosophies that go into this and how that influences their daily lives. And we'll also see that in the impious. Even if they have a religion that they hold to, if you're impious, you're going to act in a particular kind of way. And that way is going to be different than people who are irreligious or people who are religious and pious. So all religions, of course, claim a divine lawgiver. Without the divine lawgiver, you don't really have a religion. Or at least a demigod mediator between heaven and earth, and that usually that demigod is bringing down the law, is, some way transferring heavenly law to mankind. And without that relational transferation of divine law, you can't have a religion. And all religions use this divine law to specify, to some degree or another, what the best practice for engaging in a worship service actually is. And therefore, simply prioritizing something over God, or over proper worship of God even, is not worshiping another God. It's simply forgetting God. And that's that impiety. And this may be considered its own sin, but it's certainly separate from idolatry. And in fact, all religions have had to deal with this issue of impiety since the beginning of human history. And impious people were usually judged or dealt with in some way by the religious community in order to keep that religious fervor strong enough in order to maintain the morals of a particular culture. Nowadays, we live in our secular cultures, so we don't really understand the benefits to having a religious background in order to have that, connected social, moral understanding. And so we have innovations being introduced in our morals, nearly daily. And a lot of the innovations that are being introduced nowadays are so shocking to the older generations that they, are just like, see ya, I'm out of here. And really, it's no different than the other introductions that happened in their day. Their grandparents were astonished and horrified by the innovations that were being introduced. Say, for example, the innovations that were being introduced in the 1960s. Dramatic, transformative changes being introduced, and they took it as the norm. And so we have to understand that these innovations will continue until we have a solid religious background in order to back up the moral character of our society and what we claim as a good in and of itself. And all of this, really leads us to understand, okay, well, worship is different from prioritization. So how do the idols come into play? We have to understand what an idol actually is. And the definition for them, really the best definition that I can come up with is idols are a specific focus point for the worship of deities. And the point of an idol is that it provides a physical place of dedication and worship for a particular deity. And the pagans that worship idols in the past or today, or the ones that will worship them in the future, they never thought that the stone or the wood or the paint was the actual deity. Like, people just aren't that dumb. They understand, oh, I made this with my hands. It's not the God, it's representative of the God. And mythologically, I connect to my deity through physical actions. And that's the point of the idol, because I can then use this idol in my worship services in order to commune with that which is in the spiritual plane. And that's the whole point of the idol. It's a focus point. It's a physical manifestation of your belief systems. It's a actual real thing that you can see and touch. And as humans, since we have these corporeal bodies that form our reality, we have to govern ourselves according to the laws of physical relationships. And so in order to relate to something which is inherently spiritual, I have to engage in a physical act to actually get there. It's not enough to sit here and think, and just, totally go out of your brain. It's not enough. Humans are designed to actually do things. And it's really interesting because a lot of the actions and activities that, certain Buddhist religions take are all designed to utterly destroy the body, which is fascinating. There was this whole a sect of Buddhist monks who thought that it would be a great idea to try and die sitting up. And so in order to do that, they would take these medicines in order to harden their bodies, and they would stop eating. And so eventually they'd try to sit up, and so that they could die in this one particular position, sitting up, in order to more perfectly represent the fact that they were not held down by their physical bodies, but that they were transcending the physical reality to get to the spiritual. That's a separate issue. It's related, but it's separate, because all of those Buddhist traditions still have their own idols. They've got their great big Buddha, rub the Buddha belly, right? They've got all their incense. They've got their prayers that they do. They have very specific chants that they do. They try to go and do very specific physical things in order to destroy their physical bodies and in order to commune with the divine, nothingness, the void or whatever. And it's no different than any other religion in that it requires physical activity in order to engage in spiritual gains, in order to commune with that which is actually spiritual, which Buddhism is kind of fascinating because they're literally attempting to communicate with nothingness. Just astonishing, but whatever, I didn't make up that religion. Anyways, the point of this whole thing is we need a physical locus for our spiritual efforts, and that is what the idol actually does for us. And so I've got a couple examples here of different pagan practices. If the audience here is mostly Christian, some of this stuff will be new. You might not quite realize that some of this stuff is happening, but I think it's very informative, and we need to understand the differences here. The Roman sacrificial practices are fascinating to me, and I've got here an excerpt from the Oxford Dictionary of these things. So it goes, they were not functionally different from Greek sacrificial practices, although the Roman rite was distinguishable from the Greek and Etruscan. As in the Greek world, sacrifice was the central ritual of religion. The expression rem divinam facere, to make a thing sacred, shows that sacrifice was an act of transfer of ownership. On its own or part of larger celebrations, the typical sacrifice embraced 4 phases: the praefatio, the immolatio, the slaughtering, and the banquet. After the purification of the participants and of the victims, which were always domestic animals, chose in accordance with the divinity's function and the context, a procession led the people engaging in this religious activity, this worship activity, which was a sacrificial activity. That was the primary way in which the Romans worshipped before their idols. Led them to the altar of divinity. There the presiding figure celebrated the prefatio, or the preface, on a portable hearth set up beside the sacrificial altar. This rite consisted of offering incense and wine, and was the equivalent of a solemn salutation affirming the superiority of the gods. At the same time, this rite opened a ritual space and announced what was to follow. The second stage of the sacrifice was the immolatio. The presiding figure poured wine on the victim's brow, sprinkled its back with salted meal, doubtless prepared by the Vestals, and finally passed a sacrificial knife over the victim's spine. According to the prayer spoken during this rite, immolation transferred the victim from human possession to the divine. Once this transfer was effected, the sacrificers felled the victim, butchered it, and opened the corpse, now on its back. The presiding figure then performed the inspection of the exita, which were the vital organs, the peritoneum, the liver, the gallbladder, lungs, and, from the beginning of the 3rd century too, the heart. And they decided whether or not they were in good shape. And that would signal whether or not the god accepted the sacrifice or not. If the victim was unacceptable, the sacrifice had to begin again. And the banquet was composed of 2 phases. Once acceptance was obtained, the sacrificers beheaded the victim, set aside the exita, and prepared them for offering. The exita of bovines were boiled in cooking pots. Those of ovines and porcines were grilled on spits. When this cooking was done, the exita was offered to the gods, which was burnt. That meant that they were burnt, basted with mulsa, salsa, and wine. And this was done on the altar if celestial gods were in question. Offerings to aquatic gods were thrown into the water. Those for Chthonian gods were placed on the ground or in ditches. Offerings for the domains were made on a pyre resting on the ground. When the offering to the god had been consumed, the rest of the victim was seized by the presiding figure, no doubt by imposition of the hand, and thus rendered fit for human consumption. In principle, all sacrifices, except those addressed to the god of the underworld, were followed by a sacrificial banquet. Sometimes the banquet was celebrated by just the immediate participants and their helpers, along with those possessing privileges in a particular sanctuary. Sometimes the banquet united the chief sections of society, and sometimes the meat was sold in butcher shops afterwards, and sometimes it was eaten at great communal banquets, which were ultimately financed by benefactors. At the Ara Maxima of Hercules, for example, sacrificial meat had to be eaten or burnt before nightfall, a requirement giving rise to a very generous form of sacrificial banquet. Communal sacrifices were celebrated by those who exercised power in the community in question, the paterfamilias, the magistrates and priests, and the presidents of clubs. And many sacrifices were part of much larger celebrations, and in certain cases, the sacrifices themselves were celebrated in more spectacular fashion. Occasions for sacrifices, these were innumerable, from regular acts of homage shaped by sacred calendars and the ritual obligations of the city and its constituent associations, to thank offerings or contractual sacrifices, faults and involuntary oversights committed in the celebration of the cult, or of involuntary deterioration of the patrimony of the gods. These were all expiated by piacula, which were sacrifices, these sacrifices, the purpose of which was to present excuses for past or imminent action. So we see when the Roman sacrifices, what they were attempting to do was something very specific when they engaged in their sacrificial worship services. They were attempting not only to please the gods, but they were attempting to show the relationship. They were attempting to engage in a mythological relationship between themselves and with the spiritual powers. They understood that there were deities, and they wanted to connect with those deities. And what they were, and the manner in which they were trying to do this was to show ownership. They recognized, okay, so we have these things in the physical plane, but the gods rule all. So with our, gods major, we have to understand that we are not alone, and the divine relationships that we have can only be connected through sacrificial worship. So we have to show the gods that we are going to give back to them. They've given us all this bounty. We connect with the gods on these levels. The gods give us rain. The gods give us kids. The gods give us money. The gods give us all these physical things. We have to go back and then thank the gods by showing them that these things were theirs in the first place. So we're going to give them back to them, but obviously they don't eat the meat. So now this meat is going to, they didn't actually let it go to waste. They would consume the meat, but they would do it in a sacrificial manner, so that it's really interesting when you think about this, because you butcher a cow or whatever you're going to do for your sacrifice, and then you offer that meat to the gods in the Roman world. The gods don't actually do anything physical with the meat, but that doesn't stop the people from participating in this ritual sacrifice for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Some of the really incredibly intelligent people were doing this. They weren't stupid. Like, try and read some Roman laws for 5 minutes, you'd be like, okay, we're the dumb ones. But they recognized that what they were attempting to accomplish was this mythological, not only pacification of the gods if they were angry, not only that were they attempting to achieve forgiveness for their sins by doing this, but they were attempting to demonstrate in reality their own position in the cosmos. So if you have this cow and you say this cow is now the gods, that's an incredible thing to say. It means that you are putting yourself under the subjugation of that deity. It means that you are willing to submit to law and order. It means that you are willing to engage in a life which is acceptable through its practices to a divine nature. And that is a powerful, powerful thing to say. And that's one of the reasons why they're a lot smarter than we are today, because we don't want to be governed by anything. So there's actually another couple examples here that I've got which are really interesting. A lot of people don't realize this right now, but there are animal sacrifices alive and well all across the world today. And one of the places that this happens is in South Africa, in specifically the country of Ghana. There's this place, it's called Tangnab Yain, and rotting carcasses sit piled atop cement pillars, and feathers and bones stick to vertically standing logs. Dried blood covers everything at the entrance to the city of Tangnab Yain, the shrine and dwelling place of the West African deity Tangnab, and his name means chief of the earth. The shrine is considered the most powerful of the hundreds of shrines tucked away in the rock shelters, caves, and crevices of Ghana's Tonga Hills. And visiting these places means confronting the practice of animal sacrifice, which is very much still alive and well today. And people from many different ethnic groups actually come to Tengzung from all over Ghana, and some even from abroad, to consult with the god within the shrine. They bring chickens, goats, sheep, donkeys, cows, and even dogs to sacrifice. And they present offerings to curry favor in their search for fertility, stability, prosperity, security in life. Others will actually sacrifice to make amends for evil acts, which is very, very common, and it's like half the point of religion, and to reverse the negative consequences of either sin or of curses. It's very, very a common practice in a lot of African religions to curse people or to try and ward off curses. Cursing is a very big part of a lot of these Bantu religions, a lot of the other, there's a lot of different religions in Africa, but, cursing is a huge part of most of the traditional religions in Africa. And the spirits in the shrines are believed to feed specifically off the lifeblood of animals. So requests made for help and atonement must be accompanied by sacrifice. And we see here that there's something different going on than what was happening in the Roman tradition. In the Roman tradition, they understood that the gods weren't doing anything. They didn't need the physical animals at all, which makes the Roman traditions much more similar to the quintessential Western religion. The African religions don't think this way at all. It's very animalistic. And so there's a higher degree of communion between the physical and the spiritual. Meaning that, you can have an aspect of a animal come within you, according to the African religions, and that can give you powers. And no, I don't mean Marvel superhero powers, let's be real here. But it will give you benefits, it will give you strengths, it will give you other things. And a lot of people believe in this, this is where spirit animals a lot of times come into play. Additionally, the gods are all hungry all the time, and they want to feed, and they get power from being fed more often. And so these deities can shrivel up and wither away, or they can gain more and more and more power the more and more they are worshipped. And this is why we're starting to understand why it's important to differentiate between prioritization and idolatry. Because in real world practical applications, people get confused when they talk to people that believe different things than what they believe. If you don't understand what an idolatrous act actually is, you will never be able to, if you're a Christian, evangelize properly. You just won't. You won't understand what you're talking about, and you're going to say stupid things, and you're going to get laughed at because, frankly, you don't know what you're talking about. But Africa's, fascinating, super interesting to talk about, but a lot of times we don't think about, maybe some other Eastern religions either. So the third example that I've got here is from the Hindu worship of gods, as explained by the Encyclopedia Britannica. Puja in Hinduism is a ceremonial worship service ranging from brief daily rites in the home to elaborate temple rituals. The word puja is derived from the Dravidian pu, meaning flower. In its simplest form, puja usually consists of making an offering of flowers or fruit to an image of a god. The components of puja vary greatly according to the sect, community, part of the country, time of day, needs of the worshiper, and religious text followed. Generally speaking, in a puja, a deity manifested in his image is accorded the honor given to a royal guest. The attentions paid to him begin in the morning when he is gently roused from sleep and extend through the day, including ritual bathing, dressing, the serving of the usual 3 meals, and the final ceremony of putting him to bed for the night. A puja may also include a circumambulation, of the image or shrine, and in an elaborate ritual, a sacrifice or bali, and an oblation to the sacred fire, homa. Special ceremonies, according to the festival calendar, may also be observed, such as swinging the god or playing games according to the season. Ravana, the 10-headed demon king, is a common god that is actually believed to come around, and he needs to be appeased, and you have to engage in different things. And one important type of puja in Indian temple and private worship is the arati, the waving of lighted lamps before an image of a deity or a person to be honored. In performing the rite, the worshiper circles the lamp 3 or more times in a clockwise direction while chanting a prayer or singing a hymn. In Indian households, arati is a commonly observed ritual element accorded specially honored guests. It is also a part of many domestic ceremonies. And we see here an entirely different method of engaging in pagan worship. Now, of course, as a Christian, I'm going to call these things idol worship. They are not going to call it idol worship. They're just going to call it worship. And they are doing these things because they realize that they are not merely physical beings. They recognize that they have an inherent need to engage in spiritual activities. And in order to worship, you have to engage in a specific set of highly focused, intentional activities. You can't just do whatever you want. It's not going to work if you want to engage in puja to simply march around your house 45 times in the morning and that's it. It's not going to work. Why isn't that going to work? Because it doesn't follow any of the principles laid down in Hinduism. Sure, yeah, it might feel like you're doing something, but you're not following the rules of the religion that you've laid down. You can't just do whatever you want. And so it becomes really interesting when you start studying religions. Why, to answer that question, why are they doing these specific things? Why 3 times? What's so important about the number 3? Every culture has basically recognized the importance of the number 3, but we don't know why. It's not enough just to do it 1 time. It's not enough just to do it 2 times. 3 times somehow feels right. And the reason that it feels right is because we have spiritual things within us. But the number 3 also has significance to philosophical and theological ideals within most religions. Some religions are centered around the number 4. Some are on all different numbers, but primarily 3 is the number 1 measure. And the reason you can see this, if you do something 3 times, it feels magical. It feels right. It feels like you've accomplished something correctly. Best 2 out of 3, for example, is a great way to understand this. For some reason, it's just not enough to accept the results of 1. But are we really going to do 3 out of 5? Like, now we're starting to get a little crazy here. It's perfect. And, honestly, cultures without symbols, without focusing beacons of their beliefs, this kind of culture is whacked. They are struggling. And the atheist community, dare I call them something that potent, has really shot themselves in the foot in this area by removing all symbols and areas of spiritual locus, because worship and religion provides more than just a sense of meaning, which is like really important, but it also provides a place in the world. Deities and their worship provide a compass by which it is easier to navigate otherwise murky seas. Imagine you're attempting to navigate an oceanic voyage, but you don't bring any instruments of navigation with you, and you don't know how to read the stars. Sure, yeah, you can go wherever you want, totally unfettered, absolutely free. do whatever you want, but what in the world is going to save you from going in circles for the entire voyage? What's going to save you from running aground on uncharted rocky shoals? What's going to save you? Where are you going to go? You don't have any direction. You don't know where you're going to go. That horizon, man, it stretches out for a long way. And yeah, sure, you can go anywhere. Freedom's great until you don't have a destination anymore. And religion provides a destination, which is why it was so ridiculously important to the atheist community to have evolution as a progression to a greater sense of being, because they say, well, when I get my fourth arm and I'll really be having twice as much strength and I can live to 200 years, I will really be a lot better. It's like, no, you won't. You'll just be stronger and you live a little bit longer. Congratulations, your life still has no meaning. And that's one of the major problems with the anti-religious communities, is because they don't have a direction. They don't have any place that they're going. There's nowhere for them to go. But mythologically speaking, we as humans understand that we are more than our physical bodies, which is why all religions attempt to connect with spiritual things. But without a system of religious affection, you not only do not know where you're going, you have no direction, but all of the terrible and strange things that happen on your voyage on the sea of life, they don't make any sense. You know, there's no acceptable way to wipe away your sense of guilt without religion. And there's no way to exercise your profoundly spiritual muscles. And people have always had a deep and profound need to mark things like puberty, marriage, childbirth, victory, all the really important things that happen in life with some sort of religious ceremony. And nowadays, it's really interesting. We've kept the ceremony, but we've removed the whole point of the ceremony in the first place. It's like, yeah, people still get married and have weddings, but why? They don't have any meaning. If you think about it, the whole point of the wedding in the first place is gone. From an atheist perspective, it's like, why are you even doing this? Like, think about it. It's just a bunch of people getting together, spending an extraordinary amount of money. Way too much money. We spend way too much money on weddings. Please, we need to stop spending so much money on weddings. By the way, we spend an extraordinary amount of money on this wedding. It's basically just a party, and you're just celebrating two people saying, these people are probably already sleeping together, and they're probably already living together. In most of the, modern weddings that happen in the world, like, these aren't celibate, individuals that are, coming out of virgin status to go and get married. It's not even like you're celebrating some enormous life event. All you're celebrating is the fact that two people, like, really want to say that they really like each other. Yeah, I really like them. So let's have a extremely expensive party and have a ton of money spent on it. And you guys got to give us gifts. It's this extraordinary, mind-boggling thing if there's no religious element to it. And, maybe if the couple wasn't already living together, then the wedding would have some meaning because you were celebrating a big milestone. But let's be real here. That ain't happening. And forget the fact that weddings in a divorce culture literally mean nothing. Literally. But the whole idea of this long drawn out ceremony just doesn't make any sense unless you understand this deep spiritual need within the human person to engage in a ceremonial activity. And all ceremonies exist for this purpose. They all exist to allay man's undeniable need to exercise a spiritual energy. But, we can see with the wedding, it's a little bit easier to look at the wedding than to look at all ceremonies everywhere, even though, all of them exist for this purpose. But, we'll stick with our wedding example because it's really helpful. A wedding, yeah, it exists to provide the community, if such a thing even exists in the modern world, an opportunity to ratify a relationship, which, that's actually an extremely beneficial tool. It's great to be able to ratify relationships and all that kind of stuff. It's excellent. It simply doesn't happen anymore. It's not a thing. It should be, but it's not. We all know it's not. And that's actually helpful for us in understanding this in order to work through what a worship ceremony actually is. Because since that's not happening anymore, and that's like one of the major reasons for weddings, like there's only two real reasons for a wedding. One is the community aspect. That's not happening. Number two is the spiritual aspect. And we are going to focus heavily on the cosmological aspect of the weddings because we have proof here for the mythological need to engage in holy matrimony. And that proof is the fact that throughout all of human history, humankind has always demanded wedding ceremonies, regardless of your religion, regardless of whatever culture you're in. Every culture had some sort of wedding ceremony. Some of them were small. Some of them were these extraordinary, expensive, massive ordeals. And even in our postmodern world, men and women still get married, and women still demand that a man put a ring on their finger, typically pledging themselves in undying affection towards these individuals, usually kneeling before them in an attitude of humility and reverence. And people want this. They understand that this is natural to them. It's part of being a natural man to want a wedding, to want the proposal, to want everything that goes with it. And women go crazy at weddings. Why? Because it's normal to do that. It's normal, and it should be celebrated. And we understand, okay, people have been doing this since the dawn of time. That's a huge indicator that this is really important. And frankly, the fact that weddings exist at all is extremely important because it's really not necessary for a wedding to exist, especially because the ceremony doesn't. What is a ceremony? What is a ceremony? Why do two people stand in front of everyone, say some words, kiss in a particular garb? Why are we wearing white? Why are we dressed in a particular way? Why do we do things in a specific way? Why do we slowly process down an aisle? Why is this part of the process? We understand, it doesn't actually accomplish anything in the physical world. In the physical world, a wedding is like, I promise I'll never leave you. Done. I'll never leave you either. Okay, now we're married. If we're purely physical beings, you've made your pledge. That's it. Walk away. Forget the fact that you're probably gonna, divorce each other in 10 years anyways, because divorce culture ruins more relationships than anything else in the universe. But it doesn't actually accomplish anything. So we do these incredible ceremonies, but we have no idea today why we're doing them. And that's because we've lost our ability to recognize the cosmological need within ourselves to do something which is spiritual. And it is a ritual, and it's a great ritual, and it's important. And you're making these pledges before God and man to represent this mystical union between man and woman, out of which production of life emerges. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Marriages are. They're one of the most impressive, amazing things that happen in our entire world. And a lot of times we forget that. But society and marriages and, in antiquity, typically huge sacrifices were made. I described the Roman tradition. It was so normal to do huge sacrifices, big community event. Gifts were exchanged, vows were made. All of these things are immensely spiritual in nature. All of these things. And society has always felt that relationships ought to be governed and blessed. Therefore, marriages had to be done before God and man. And we see that there's this immensely spiritual need to engage in a specific activity. It's not enough to simply have a man and a woman, say, for example, they skydive. Is that a wedding? It's extraordinary. It's huge. There's all these rituals. You got to make sure you get your zippers done and your backpack on correctly, and you got to get your selfie stick out there and all this other kind of stuff. Okay, that's not a wedding, and we all understand it's not a wedding. It's ridiculous. Some people try to make it a wedding, but really people are just laughing at those people because they're ridiculous. It's silly. You know, you can't wed dogs. They just don't get it. Yeah, they'll stand there and take the pictures, but they're not going to get it. And the reason they don't get it is because they're not profoundly spiritual creatures. Weddings only happen amongst mankind because mankind is different. And a lot of evangelicals don't actually know this, but traditional Christianity has always used symbols and images of heavenly things to convey heavenly messages. You know, and they don't realize, a lot of times, the evangelical world don't realize that simply having an image of a cross in your church does the exact same thing for them as their traditional forebears who used icons. And the images of Bibles and missionaries, the cross, the tomb, whatever you have in these evangelical churches are all attempts by the evangelical to engage in to connect with their immensely potent need for iconography and for the spiritual focus point through which they can more readily engage in worship. Because remember, it's not enough just to simply sit there and think real hard. It doesn't do it for you. And you'll feel so empty trying to do that. It's not enough. It doesn't feel right. And the reason it doesn't feel right is because it's not. And no form of traditional Christianity has ever accepted that as a good alternative to the spiritual things. We live in a physical world, so we use physical things to help us engage in religion. And in our, and we have to understand that the incarnation is a game changer. Christ made visible the invisible God, and thus he allowed himself to be depicted in imagery. If he was born today, there would be pictures of him everywhere, and that would be perfectly acceptable. If somebody paints his portrait in the 1st century AD, that's fine. He's physically incarnate. If his mold is made, if somebody describes what his nose looks like to someone else, that's a form of physical representation of an actual being. And it is inevitable if you are incarnate. Inevitable that somebody's going to see you, know what you're going to look like, tell somebody else what you look like. Boom. Basically, at this point, you've got you might as well have photographs. And icons in traditional Christianity depict real people. And what's interesting is the second commandment protects us from creating fantastical creatures that replace the true God. That's the primary thing here. Icons depict real people and real events that draw us to the true nature of God, to the true God. And worship and veneration, as I said in the beginning of this video, they are not the same. Worshipping an idol is the equivalent of replacing God with a different deity, with an entirely different set of philosophies, with an entirely different theology, and your morals are messed up, and your relationships are messed up. It's like replacing your wife with her sister. Yeah, you can imagine why God would be pissed, right? Like, your wife would be so mad, and she deserves to be mad. It would be horrifying. You can't do that. And so, very, 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 very different. Venerating an icon is not the same thing as worshiping the icon. Venerating is an act of respect and love that glorifies the Creator, which is sort of like, saluting a soldier in an act of respect and honor that shows your loyalty to your country. And I could talk more about the veneration issue. I probably should, but we're not going to get into that too crazy right now. But, excuse me, God instructed Moses actually to create images. And just in case anyone thought that God's commandment to Moses that we read earlier excluded all visual images of anything, that could potentially be misconstrued as an idol, Exodus chapter 35, or chapter 36, verses 35 through 37, 9, actually have instructions from God to Moses to tell him to make images of heavenly things, specifically cherubim embroidered on the curtains of the tabernacle, and statues of the same cast for the Ark of the Covenant. So obviously we see here that it's not images that are the issue here. It's our relationship to these images. And icons do a very specific thing for us, and we love them for what they do for us, because as traditional Christians, we're not like separate from all of the religions of the world that say, oh, we have all these spiritual locusts. Well, the Christians are like, well, we can't have anything. The Muslims tried that, and they do that, and it's not so great. It's very empty. It's very ugly. It's very hard to worship, which is why you have to engage in fundamentalist ideology if you don't have spiritual locus in order to physically engage in a spiritual activity. But icons are really special because they teach us our history. And in the early church, never mind the fact that there was no official New Testament canon for almost 400 years, there were very few copies of the scriptures because there was no printing press. And additionally, most Christians were illiterate. Not most Christians in the early church, this is the Roman era. Most Romans could read, but a lot of Christians were illiterate. And, if Christianity spread outside Rome proper, the illiteracy grew. And so, even today, think about it for 5 minutes, we have a huge contingency of Christians that do not have the ability to read, everyone under the age of 5. But icons teach us the stories of the scriptures and the lives of the saints, and that whole story of salvation, and it invites us to be a part of that history, and thus they provide this incredible benefit, spiritual benefit to us, that we can see the baptism, even if we can't read about it, even if we're not reading about it all the time. That visual power, it has punch to it. We connect to it. It's powerful, it's important, and it's awesome, and it's beautiful. And icons help to teach us our theology. Icons are no nor ordinary paintings. They're full of symbolic meaning. They convey theological truths of the true faith. Even from the very colors to the stances of the people, to the scenery and the lighting, icons teach us who God is and who we are in relation to him. For example, in most of the festal icons of Christ, the Nativity, Theophany, Crucifixion, Resurrection, you'll notice that Christ is the light emerging from the darkness of the cave, the water, Golgotha, Hades, whatever. Or you'll typically see Christ wearing a red tunic with a blue cloak, showing us that he was divine, red, but took on humanity, blue, and his mother, the Theotokos, is typically dressed the opposite, as she and we are human first, blue, and we take on Christ's divinity, red, which is why she'll have a red cloak. Icons also draw us nearer to the saints. We believe in a church that is united across both time and space. In other words, the saints that have preceded us are just as much a part of the living body of Christ as our own friends and family. Just as we might cherish an image of a loved one who's no longer physically with us, and we might carry that image with us and even kiss it when we miss them, we cherish the images of Christ, his mother, and the saints of those whom we love and those who guide us in our lives, whose examples are incredibly powerful and potent for us. And icons call us to be still and to worship. And unlike other forms of visual art, Orthodox iconography is specifically created with worship in mind. As the most traditional form of Christianity, this is really important. There's a stillness and a peace about the figures, even when they're shown in action. And what seems to be a reverse in perspective is a message to us that it is we who vanish in the distance when we move away from God. Icons help us to focus our prayers to God and help us dispel the distracting images that flit through our minds at the prompting of the demons. And icons call us to the heavenly realm. Everything about icons that we've already mentioned, their themes, their symbols, their characters, their artistic style, these all seek to draw us towards Christ and his holy ones. And there's another reason why icons are not painted realistically. If you look at the Orthodox iconography, it's not supposed to be realistic, and that's on purpose. They're meant to draw us not to the icon themselves, but beyond the icon, beyond the image, to the heavenly reality they depict. And unlike other art, and certainly unlike idols, icons do not allow us to get stuck in the beauty of this world, but they call us to be a part of the world transfigured by God's grace and love. Icons are these immense, powerful, incredible windows to heaven, literally a window to heaven. And by standing before the icon and worshiping God, you draw yourself closer to heaven than you could do without that spiritual locus, without that spiritual focus. Icons are powerful. They're good for us, and humanity has always used them and used them to great effect. But the problem is idolatry. And idolatry is a very real thing. But we have to know what it actually is to be able to combat it. We have to be able to understand that idols and icons may have similarities, but they're ultimately different. And the theory of prioritization has nothing to do with either. Idolatry is a very real thing that happens even today in the modern world. A lot of times we don't recognize it when it comes because we're always thinking of prioritization as opposed to actual idolatry. And that impiety is not the same thing as the idolatry at all. Think about, for example, a cult leader. Cult leaders are typically worshipped by their followers, and that is an idolatrous relationship that you can have. Energy work is often synonymous with the worship or at least the pacification of demons, and I think Christians engage in energy work at their peril. You have to be careful by what you're doing. There's a very spiritual world out there, and you have to be way, way, way more careful than you probably are if you're engaging in energy work. Just be careful. Research what you're doing, because energy might just be another word for spiritual activity. Straight up demon worship is alive and well today, and it always will be. And demons are really good at hiding their identities and tricking you into thinking that they're somebody nice. This is why God told us to test the spirits. Of course, then Christians will also encounter very real religions that really believe in other gods and that practice what we would consider rightfully to be idolatry. And often when persons convert to Christianity from other cultures, they just keep their traditions of praying to other gods and sort of combine the two, and that's a really big problem. And there are other forms of idolatry that we will actually encounter in the real world, but we need to be able to distinguish that issue from the issue of impiety. And it's not a real issue to prioritize over things above the worship of God when it is appropriate to do so. For example, when you're out buying groceries, you don't need to be singing at the top of your lungs some worship song. If you're a deep sea diver fighting off a squid with a harpoon, you don't need to be kneeling and praying to God in that moment. It's okay to do other things other than worship. We just have to remember to worship, because if you forget the proper and appropriate worship of God, then you will be in danger of impiety and slowly starving your soul anyways. But you will not be in danger of idolatry by engaging in impiety. By not going to church and engaging in these specific religious activities that were set up to help us worship, you are an impious person. Trying to just do everything on your own is not going to work. And the reason that it's not going to work is because you're not designed to be able to do that. And you are basically coming up with your own religion. You might as well not even be Christian. In fact, you really aren't, because being a Christian requires worship, and worship is done in a specific way. And the things that we do all have meaning, they all have purpose, they have a reason why they're done in the way that they are done, and why one activity is not good enough to be considered worship and other activities are good enough to be considered worship. You can't do it by yourself. You have to do a particular thing in a particular way according to the rules of that religion. And you have to understand, like, you can't set up a job as an idol in your life. That's not a thing. You're just forgetting about God. That's it. That's all that's happening there. And impiety is a very dangerous thing that happens all on its own, but it is separate and distinct from idolatry, which is very specifically the worship of a spiritual entity through the medium of whatever your idol is, whether it's a picture of Buddha or a shrine covered in blood in the Tangnam region. Okay, like these are very, 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 very different things, and we have to be able to recognize them, or we're committing fraud, and we just don't know what we're talking about. So, for example, with this whole, difference between the icons and how we're supposed to actually interact with them and how we're supposed to be venerating and all of that different kind of stuff, I've actually got some different icons here, and they'll help to illustrate some of what I'm talking about. So you see here, this is an icon specifically of Jesus. And think for a moment, like, okay, now that we understand what the purpose of this is, like it's a spiritual locus, it's a window into heaven, and nobody is worshiping the paint. Nobody is worshiping the wood. Like, that would be really dumb. But we have a picture here of Jesus. So the incarnation changes everything, so people can now see Jesus Christ. We can have pictures of him, and we can have iconography of him. The big thing here is God is a jealous God, and he doesn't want us to worship anyone else. Well, that's a picture of Jesus. Who am I worshiping? Jesus. So what's the problem here? Now, this picture is not what you worship. It's not what you worship at all. Why would you worship a picture? There's nothing. It's a picture, right? It's a painting that helps us to focus our spiritual energies, our spiritual muscles, in order to get through and communicate better with the heavenly beings. In this case, specifically God. And the whole point of this activity is, okay, well, we are attempting to commune with the triune Godhead. Okay, so how are we going to do that? As a Christian, you got to think about, okay, what specific activities are you supposed to do that are going to facilitate this, and what things are going to make it more difficult? So if you have nothing anywhere at any time, it's just you. And it's very difficult because you are a physical being, and your physicality gets in the way of your spirituality. And unless you have some way to use both together in concert with each other, you end up fighting against each other. Your physical body fights against your spiritual soul when you're attempting to worship. So the whole point of traditional Christianity is to say, okay, how can we balance this out? How can we become as healthy as possible? How can we do the things which are necessary in order to get over that hurdle? And one of the ways that we can do that is through the use of iconography. And, we have other images as well. So, you say you have like this image, for example, the image of your guardian angel. Well, we already saw that Moses was commanded to make images of angels specifically, and tons of angels have revealed themselves to humans over the years. So this is obviously an acceptable thing to have images of. And you're not supposed to pray to you're not supposed to worship your guardian angel, but you can ask your guardian angel to come down and watch over you and protect you and do all the things that the guardian angels are supposed to do. And it's like, well, they should be doing that anyways. the hubris, right? Like, what if you offended your guardian angel by being a stinker? Maybe you should apologize. Say, come back. Wait. Come on. Think about it for 5 minutes. This is a relational universe that we live in. This isn't like math. This isn't like, well, I'm a Christian, so now I get my guardian angel and I'm done. What? Maybe you should ask God to send down your guardian angel in order to watch over you. And these are things that Christians have thought of and dealt with and have developed specific modes of dealing with this issue for, thousands of years. And it's, the definition of hubris to say, well, I'm going to throw all of that out and I'm just going to do whatever I want, whatever I think, and whatever I feel is best. Of course, that's what typically the modern man is wanted to do, but it's not particularly a great plan. You can have other images of other saints. So like I have this one here. This one's a little bit bigger, heavier. This here is an image of Saint Mary of Egypt. Saint Mary of Egypt was a woman who really struggled with sin, and she went out into the desert, and she dedicated 20 years to being out in the desert in order to defeat her lusts. And she did. And she's recognized all over the world today as a symbol of people who want to defeat who want to defeat their passions and who want to gain a degree of mastery over themselves. And you can ask Saint Mary of Egypt to pray for you. And this is a perfectly normal thing that we do all the time anyways. We ask people to pray for us, and we ask people to, provide guidance in our lives to help us. How can we be a better person? How can we, do a better job as Christians? And, what can we do better? And, teach us, guide us. And this is, normal things that we ask real living human beings all the time. But why wouldn't we ask the people that have gone on to pray for us? What about that great cloud of witnesses? What about Moses and Elijah, who appear in physical bodies in the transfiguration? What about, Samuel, who was called by the witch of Endor to come back? We see all of these different instances of the dead still being very alive in the Christian tradition. And remember, God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. And it's completely normal in traditional Christian culture to use these spiritual locus, and we call them specifically windows to heaven, to help us in our worship. And we never forget who God is. They help us. They help us remember who he is, and they help us to go after him and to love him more. They don't hurt the process. Can you get confused? Sure, yeah, but do your research and don't be confused. Can you be confused without icons? Yeah, you can be twice as confused without icons. So it's not an issue of, that the icons are leading you astray. It's that we just don't recognize the spiritual need within ourselves. And so we try to go, and the many Christian traditions have tried to throw out all of this stuff and taken a very Islamic approach, which is a fundamentalist approach. Because without those spiritual helps, all you have is yourself. All you have is what's within you. And so you end up with these barren, ugly churches. You end up with these, barren, ugly religious services. And so the only thing that you have is emotion. And emotion is a very poor substitute for spiritual focus. If tears are streaming down your face, it may feel very powerful, but it's not spiritual. It's emotional, and they should not be confused. And emotions will only get you through a very small, part of your life. But a spiritual engine, a spiritual muscle which is developed within you, can take you through literally hell and back again. Like you're going to be fine. So it's all very interesting, and it's very important that we talk about this kind of stuff because it's not all the same. So hopefully this very long and comprehensive video has been helpful in order to be able to explain what I'm actually trying to mean. Hopefully I've been able to communicate my thoughts appropriately. Hopefully this video has been helpful. If you're still here, please consider subscribing. It makes a really big difference for me. Helps me out a ton. I'll keep sharing very, very different content from what you're probably going to get in any other platform anywhere. The traditional press platform is a place where we can discuss ideas that aren't mainstream, but we're going to be talking about the deep philosophical issues that actually govern the way that we interact with the world. So tune in for more inspiring and interesting content. Tune in for more monarchy and traditional ideas. Thank you so much for coming on the Traditional Press. Stay strong out there, folks, and I'll catch you all next time.
This has been the Traditional Press Podcast. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for more traditional ideas and exploration of the why behind the what.